She had "UNCLAIMED" written on her back. So I wrapped her in my coat and walked away. The dust had settled on Perdition Creek for all of 20 minutes when I rode into town that October morning, the kind of quiet that follows a storm, or in this case, what the locals would later call the incident at Murphy's auction house. I'd been riding hard for 3 days, chasing a lead on cattle rustlers that had gone cold somewhere near the Colorado border. My horse, Jeremiah, was bone tier, and my stomach felt like it was eating itself from the inside out. All I wanted was a hot meal, a cold beer, and maybe a soft bed that didn't involve sleeping on rocks. Perdition Creek wasn't much to look at. A dozen buildings scattered along a muddy main street, like these thrown by a drunk gambler. The kind of town that existed because it was halfway between somewhere and nowhere, serving travelers who had the misfortune to need supplies or shelter in this particular stretch of God's forgotten country. The first thing I noticed was the crowd gathered outside Murphy's auction house. About 30 people stood in a loose circle, their voices carrying that particular mix of excitement and unease that follows when something shocking has just happened. Some were laughing, others shaking their heads, but all had that look of folks who just witnessed something they'd be talking about for years to come. I tied Jeremiah to the hitching post in front of the saloon and walked over, my spurs jingling against the wooden sidewalk. The crowd parted slightly as I approached, the way groups do when a stranger wearing a marshal's badge shows up. "Afternoon," I said to no one in particular. "Somebody want to tell me what's got everyone so stirred up?" A weathered rancher with a gray beard spat into the dust. "Auction just finished, Marshal." Old Murphy was selling off the belongings of folks who couldn't pay their debts. And a woman in a faded blue dress stepped forward. "There was a girl," she said, her voice tight with something between anger and shame. "Chinese girl, maybe 18, 19 years old." Murphy put her up for auction, like she was a piece of furniture. My blood went cold. He was selling a person, said she owed money for passage from San Francisco, the rancher explained. Claimed she was indentured, had to work off her debt. When nobody would bid high enough, he trailed off, looking uncomfortable. What? The woman in blue finished the story. He had his boys paint "UNCLAIMED" across her back and told her to sit on the steps until someone wanted to buy her contract cheap. Said she'd stay there until someone did, or until she died of exposure. I felt something dark and cold settle in my chest. In all my years wearing a badge, I'd seen plenty of cruelty, but there was something particularly vile about reducing a human being to unclaimed property. "Where is she now?" The woman pointed toward the auction house. "Still sitting there, been maybe an hour since the auction ended. Most folks have gone about their business." I pushed through the crowd and walked toward Murphy's place. The auction house was a long, low building with a covered porch running along the front. Sitting on the steps, hunched over with her arms wrapped around her knees, was the girl they'd been talking about. She was small and thin, wearing a simple gray dress that had seen better days. Her black hair hung loose around her face, partially hiding her features. But it was her back that made my hands clench into fists. Someone had painted "UNCLAIMED" in large crude black letters across the fabric of her dress, the paint still wet enough to glisten in the afternoon sun. She didn't look up when I approached, just sat there staring at the ground between her feet. I could see her shoulders shaking slightly, whether from cold or fear or rage. I couldn't tell. "Miss?" I said softly. She raised her head slowly, and I saw eyes that held more weariness than any 18-year-old should carry. They were dark brown, almost black, and completely without hope. "You are here to buy?" she asked in accented English. "No, miss. I'm here to help." She studied my face for a long moment, then shook her head. "No help. Must work off debt. Mr. Murphy say so." I glanced back at the crowd, which had mostly dispersed. Then at the auction house, through the windows, I could see Murphy himself, a fat man with greasy hair and a vest that strained against his belly, counting money at the table. "What's your name?" I asked the girl. "Limay," she said quietly. "Well, Limay, I'm Marshal Thomas Brennan, and I've got something to say about this situation." I climbed the steps and pushed open the door to the auction house. Murphy looked up from his counting, his small eyes taking in my badge and the Colt hanging at my side. "Help you, Marshal," he said, trying to sound friendly but not quite managing it. "You can start by telling me what gives you the right to sell human beings." Murphy's face flushed. "Now hold on there. I ain't selling nobody. Girl owes me money fair and square. He paid her passages from San Francisco, put her up in my boarding house, fed her for 3 weeks. She was supposed to work off the debt, but she's been nothing but trouble, won't do what she's told, keeps trying to run off. So you put her up for auction like cattle." Duels. "He was selling her work contract," Murphy said, his voice getting defensive. "Perfectly legal. Got papers to prove it." "Show me." Murphy fumbled around in a desk drawer and produced a crumpled document. I looked it over, though I'd already made up my mind about what I was going to do. The contract was a piece of work. I'll give Murphy that. It was technically legal under territorial law, though it stank of exploitation from every line. Limay had signed it, or marked it with an X, rather, agreeing to work for Murphy for 2 years to pay off a debt of $300. The problem was, Murphy had been charging her for room and board, clothes, even the paintbrush he'd used to humiliate her, ensuring the debt would never actually be paid off. "This contract is null and void," I said, tossing the papers back at him. "What? You can't do that." "I just did. Miss Lee is free to go." Murphy stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "That girl owes me money, and I mean to collect. You got no right." "I've got every right," I said, letting my hand rest on my gun butt. "See, what you've done here isn't endured servitude, it's slavery, and last I checked, that was illegal in these United States. She ain't a citizen, she's Chinese. Doesn't matter, the 13th Amendment doesn't have a citizenship requirement." Murphy's face was getting redder by the minute. "I'll have your badge for this, Brennan. You got friends in the territorial government. You're welcome to try." I tipped my hat. "Have a good day, Murphy." I walked back outside to find Limay still sitting on the steps, apparently unmoved by the shouting match that had been audible through the thin walls. "It's done," I told her. "You're free." She looked up at me with those tired eyes. "Free to do what?" "I have no money, no place to go, no family." It was a good question, and one I hadn't fully thought through. In my anger at Murphy, I'd focused on getting her away from him without considering what came next. He looked at this girl, this young woman, really sitting there, with "UNCLAIMED" painted across her back like some kind of brand, and I made a decision that would change both our lives. "First thing," I said, shrugging out of my coat, "we get rid of that." He'd wrap my brown duster over her shoulders, covering the cruel word that Murphy had marked her with. The coat was too big for her, hanging almost to her ankles, but it served its purpose. "Come on," I said, offering her my hand. "Let's get you cleaned up and fed, and then we'll figure out the rest." She hesitated for a moment, then took my hand and let me help her at her feet. Her fingers were cold and calloused from hard work. "Why?" she asked as we walked away from the auction house. "Why help me?" I thought about that as we made our way down the street. Why was I helping her? I'd come to town looking for cattle rustlers and instead found myself rescuing someone from what amounted to legal slavery. It wasn't my job, wasn't my responsibility, and would probably cause me more trouble than I needed. "Because it's the right thing to do," I said finally. We walked to the hotel, the only decent one in town, and I got her a room and ordered a hot bath sent up. While she cleaned up, I went to the general store and bought her some clothes that actually fit: a simple brown dress, undergarments, stockings, and a pair of sturdy boots. Nothing fancy, but clean and practical. When I knocked on her door an hour later, the transformation was remarkable. Clean and dressed in clothes that fit, Li Mei looked like a completely different person. She was actually quite pretty, with delicate features and intelligent eyes that no longer held that dead, hopeless look. "Thank you," she said simply. "You hungry?" "Very." We went to the hotel dining room, where the other patrons stared at us with undisguised curiosity. A white martial dining with a Chinese woman was apparently quite a spectacle in Perdition Creek. He ordered for both of us beef stew, bread, coffee, and apple pie, and watched her eat with the careful concentration of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in quite some time. "Tell me about yourself," I said after she'd taken the edge off her hunger. "Not much to tell," she said, cutting her beef into precise, small pieces. "I came from Guangzhou province in China. My father sold me to pay gambling debts. The men who bought me brought me to San Francisco, said I would work in their restaurant, but when we arrived, they sold me to Mr. Murphy instead." "How long ago?" 3 months. Murphy said I would work as housekeeper, cook, help in his boarding house. But then she trailed off, her face flushing. He wanted me to do other things I would not do, so he put me in the cellar. Said I was ungrateful, that he would sell my contract to someone who would appreciate his generosity. I felt a cold anger settling in my chest again. "Li Mei, no one has the right to force you to do anything you don't want to do. Not Murphy, not anyone." She looked at me with something that might have been the beginning of hope. "In China, women have no choice. We do what men tell us, or we suffer. This isn't China." "No," she said softly, "it is not." We finished our meal in comfortable silence, and then I walked her back to her room. As we stood in the hallway, she turned to face me. "What happens now, Marcel Brennan? Call me Tom, and I don't know yet, but we'll figure something out." The next morning, I was awakened by pounding on my door. He opened it to find Murphy standing in the hallway with 2 men I didn't recognize, big, hard-looking types, with the unmistakable air of hired muscle. "Marcel Brennan," Murphy said, trying to sound official. "I'm here with representatives of the territorial court. That Chinese girl is stolen property, and we're here to reclaim her." I stepped into the hallway, closing my door behind me. "Is that so? You got paperwork to back that up?" One of the strangers, a man with a scar running down his left cheek, spoke up. "We don't need paperwork. That girl belongs to Mr. Murphy until her debt is paid. And you are Jake Morrison. I represent certain business interests in San Francisco." I'd heard of Morrison. He was enforcer for the Chinese slave trade, the kind of man who made his living off human misery. The fact that Murphy had called him in told me everything I needed to know about the seriousness of the situation. "Well, Mr. Morrison, Li Mei doesn't belong to anyone. She's a free woman under the laws of the United States." Morrison smiled, showing yellow teeth. "That's where you're wrong, Marshal. See, territorial law is a funny thing. Local magistrates have a lot of discretion in matters of contract law. And Judge Hartwell, who happens to be a friend of Mr. Murphy's, has ruled that the girl's contract is valid and binding. Convenient, ain't it, though?" Morrison's hand moved closer to his gun. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to hand over the girl, and we're all going to pretend this misunderstanding never happened." I looked at the 3 men facing me and did some quick calculations. Morrison was dangerous. I could see it in his eyes and the easy way he wore his weapons. The other stranger was big but looked slow. Murphy was a coward who'd probably run at the first sign of real trouble. "No," I said. Morrison's smile widened. "I was hoping you'd say that. Things might have gotten ugly right there in the hotel hallway, but Li Mei's door opened and she stepped out, still wearing my coat over her new dress. "It's all right," she said quietly. "I will go." "Like hell you will," I said. "I do not want you to be hurt because of me," she said. "We have caused enough trouble." Morrison reached for her arm, and I moved without thinking. My Colt was in my hand before he could complete the motion, the barrel pointed at his chest. "Touch her and die," I said conversationally. The hallway went very quiet. Morrison's hand froze halfway to Lee May's arm, and I could see him reassessing the situation. Murphy took a step backward. "This isn't over, Brennan," Morrison said finally. "No, it's not, but it's over for today." After they left, Lee May turned to me with tears in her eyes. "You should not have done that. Now they will kill you. Let them try. You do not understand. Morrison has many men. He will not let this go." She was right, of course. I just made some very dangerous enemies. And over what? A girl I'd known for less than 24 hours. Any reasonable person would have told me I was being a fool. But as I looked at Lee May standing there in my coat, trying to be brave, I realized that sometimes being reasonable isn't the same as being right. "Pack your things," I said. "We're leaving. Where will we go?" "West. I know a place." An hour later, we were riding out of Perdition Creek. Lee May sat behind me on Jeremiah, her arms wrapped around my waist, my coat still draped over her shoulders. I'd bought supplies and ammunition and strapped my Winchester to the saddle within easy reach. As we crested the hill overlooking the town, I saw Morrison and his men mounting up to follow us. I'd expected as much. "Tom," Lee May said softly. "Yeah? Thank you for treating me like a person." I thought about that as we rode into the wilderness, Morrison and his men somewhere behind us. In the distance, the Rocky Mountains rose like a wall against the sky, promising both sanctuary and danger in equal measure. "You are a person," I said finally. "That's not something you need to thank me for recognizing." The chase lasted 3 days. Morrison's men were good, but they were tracking us through country I knew better than my own backyard. I led them through river crossings that would wash out our trail, over rocky ground that wouldn't hold hoofprints, and through narrow canyons where an ambush would be suicide. On the third night, we made camp in a hidden valley I'd used before when tracking outlaws. There was water, grass for the horse, and stone walls on 3 sides that would make it impossible for anyone to surprise us. Lee May sat by the fire, still wearing my coat despite the warm evening. She'd barely spoken since we'd left town, but I could see her thinking, working through something in her mind. "Tom," she said finally. "Yeah? What you did back in town, standing up to those men, was that because I am a woman who needed help, or because you would do the same for anyone?" It was a good question, and one I'd been thinking about myself. Both, I guess, but mostly because what Murphy was doing was wrong, and somebody needed to say so. Even though I am Chinese, especially because you're Chinese, makes it easier for men like Murphy to pretend you don't matter. She was quiet for a long time after that, staring into the fire. When she spoke again, her voice was soft but determined. "I want to learn to shoot." "What?" "Your gun. I want to learn to use it. If Morrison catches us, I do not want to be helpless." He looked at her sitting there in the firelight, small and delicate, but with something fierce burning in her eyes. "All right, but not here. Too noisy. Tomorrow, when we reach Silver Creek." Silver Creek was a mining town about a day's ride north, built around a played-out silver mine, but still home to maybe 200 people who were too stubborn or too poor to move on. More importantly, it was far enough from Perdition Creek that Morrison would have a hard time tracking us, and it had a sheriff who owed me a favor. We rode into town the next afternoon, and I took Lee May straight to see Sheriff Bob Crawford. Bob was an old friend from my army days, a solid man who'd lost his left arm at Gettysburg, but could still outshoot most men with his right. "Tom Brennan," he said, getting up from behind his desk, "what brings you to my little corner of paradise?" He explained the situation, and Bob listened without interruption, his face growing grimmer as the story went on. "Morrison, you said?" "Yeah, I know him. He's been through here before, collecting runaways. Not the kind of man you want as an enemy." I didn't have much choice. Bob looked at Limay, who stood quietly beside me. Miss, you got family somewhere? Somewhere safe you could go? No family, she said, only what Mr. Murphy told me. Well, Bob said, settling back in his chair, seems to me you folks need to disappear for a while. Let things cool down. Any suggestions? As it happens, yes. My sister runs a boarding house about 50 miles north of here, in a little town called Haven's Rest. Nice, quiet place. She could use some help, and it's far enough off the beaten track that Morrison would have a hell of a time finding you. It sounded like a good plan. That evening, Bob took us to the edge of town and gave Limay her first shooting lesson. She was a natural, steady hands, good eye, and the kind of focused concentration that made her a quick learner. You're sure about this? He asked as we prepared to leave the next morning. Limay looked back at Silver Creek, then at me. She had given me my coat back that morning, saying she didn't need to hide anymore. In the early morning light, she looked strong and determined. I am sure, she said. For the first time since I left China, I am sure of something. We never saw Morrison again. Word reached us a few weeks later that he'd been killed in a gunfight in Denver, something about a card game gone wrong. Murphy's auction house burned down under mysterious circumstances, and he left Perdition Creek owing money to half the town. Limay and I stayed in Heaven's Rest for 2 months, and in that time something neither of us had expected began to grow between us. It started with respect. She admired my willingness to stand up for what was right, and I admired her strength and determination to build a new life. But respect turned to friendship, and friendship turned to something deeper. When I finally asked her to marry me, she said yes without hesitation. We're married by the circuit preacher, on a crisp November morning, with half the town in attendance. Limay wore a white dress that Bob's sister had sewn for her, and I wore my best suit. It wasn't the fanciest wedding anyone had ever seen, but it was ours. That night, as we sat on the porch of our little house, Limay leaned against my shoulder and said, "Do you ever regret it? What you did in Perdition Creek?" I thought about that dusty main street, the crowd gathered around Murphy's auction house, and a young woman sitting on the steps with UNCLAIMED painted across her back. "No," I said, "not for a minute. Even though it cost you your job." It was true the territorial government had relieved me of my marshal's duties after Murphy's friends complained. But Bob had offered me a deputy position in Silver Creek, and we decided to make a fresh start. "Some things are more important than jobs," I said. Limay smiled and took my hand. "I used to think I was unclaimed," she said. "But I was wrong. I just hadn't found the right person to claim me yet." I squeezed her hand and looked out at the mountains, thinking about the strange turns life can take. A year ago, I'd been a federal marshal chasing cattle rustlers. Now I was a small-town deputy married to a woman who taught me that sometimes the most important thing you can do is recognize someone else's humanity. "You were never unclaimed," I said. "You just needed someone to see that you belonged to yourself." We sat there in comfortable silence as the sun set over the mountains, two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and decided to build something good together. Sometimes the best things in life come disguised as trouble. Sometimes you have to walk away from everything you know to find what you're really looking for. And sometimes wrapping someone in your coat and walking away is the beginning of everything that matters. Limay and I lived in Heaven's Rest for the rest of our lives. We raised 3 children there, and I served as sheriff for 23 years. Limay opened a school for the immigrant children who came through town, teaching them English and helping them navigate a new country. People sometimes asked her about the early days, about Murphy and Morrison and the auction house. She'd always smile and say the same thing: "The past is gone. What matters is what we build today." But I remember, a young woman with "UNCLAIMED" painted across her back, sitting on the steps of an auction house in a dusty town that probably doesn't exist anymore. I remember the moment I decided that no human being should ever be reduced to unclaimed property. And I remember wrapping her in my coat and walking away from everything I thought I knew about my life. It was the best decision I ever made.